Ruth as a member of the Culinary Literacy Committee and also as the husband of the chair of the Institutional Advancement Committee of the Free Library. You know, the Free Library is dedicated, it has important goals. It's dedicated to advancing literacy, guiding learning, inspiring curiosity, and these goals are embedded in all of the programs that the Free Library does. And the most important one, perhaps tonight, is to think about the Culinary Literacy Center that the Free Library opened last year. It's a demonstration kitchen, but it does more than just provide cooking exhibitions. It provides lessons in reading, in math, in science, taste bud literacy, but the earlier ones, in terms of math, in terms of ESL, things that you can really teach through cooking have become a very important part of the work here at the Free Library. Obviously, work like this takes place only with support from people like you. So after you go first to freelibrary.org/cook to see all the programs at the Culinary Literacy Center, if you would please go to freelibrary.org/support and make your online donation. That would be a wonderful thing to do. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Ruth Reichl, someone whose work I've appreciated for many years. When Gourmet magazine was discontinued in 2009, an event that I'm sure many of us remember with a lot of sadness, Ruth sought solace in the place she knew best, the kitchen. She went on to pen Delicious, a debut novel about a shuttered New York food magazine that became a New York Times bestseller. And this achievement followed 3 successful food memoirs and restaurant critic work at the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. In terms of those books, let me remind you that upstairs not only is the book that Ruth will be speaking about tonight for sale, but a good many of her older previous works are for sale also, and if you have not read them, I would urge you to buy them. They're in paperback form upstairs, so you can get a good stack. So the new book, My Kitchen Year, 136 Recipes That Saved My Life, is a culinary memoir celebrating the curative power of cooking. And it also celebrates the power and enjoyment of reading about cooking and reading about the warmth, the closeness, the things that cooking does for us that few other things do. I think there's a quote from Alice Waters that perhaps sums up Ruth's work better than anything else, and let me read it to you. No one writes as warmly and engagingly about the all-important intersection of food, life, love, and loss. This book is a lyrical and deeply intimate journey told through recipes as only Ruth can do. So we're pleased to have her with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ruth Reichl.
So it's always a pleasure to be back in Philadelphia, and especially a pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite auditoriums anywhere, and one of my favorite audiences anywhere. So, hi. This book was pretty much an accidental book. I did not set out to write a cookbook. So I want to tell you a little bit about how it happened. I was on tour for the second Gourmet Cookbook when I got a call from my boss in New York telling me that I had to cut the tour short and come back. I was in Seattle, and I said, well, I can't. I have to go to Portland tomorrow. And he said, no, you really have to come back. And I said, do you want to give me a hint? And he said, no, just come back. So I, of course, thought that I was going to be fired. And nobody could have been more shocked than I was the next day when I was standing with my staff in the conference room, and they said the magazine was closed. Sorry. I have been talking a lot for the last month. Gourmet was not just a job for most of the people who worked there. I mean, we had, the magazine was almost 70 years old, and there were a lot of people who had been working there for their entire careers, people who had been there 35 or 40 years. So we were really losing not just a job, but a family. And we did what any sensible group of people would do. James, our drinks editor, went into his office, which was filled with hundreds of bottles of wine, and he said, "We're not leaving them one bottle." And we started drinking, and at 5 o'clock, none of us was ready to go home yet. So I said, "Everybody come to my house," and the cooks brought whatever they had been working on in the kitchen, and we all went back to my house and had a wake. And the next morning, they all went in to pack up their offices and start looking for new jobs. And I had to go back on the road for the Gourmet Cookbook. Truly one of the weirder times of my life. It was not my book. It belonged to the people who had just closed my beloved magazine. And on top of that, every place I went, it was kind of like a revival meeting. I mean, people wanted to stand up and testify about what the magazine had meant to them, and often with tears running down their cheeks. And it was a very emotional time. It went on for more than a month. And when I finally came home, I realized that everybody else had sort of gone through their grieving, but mine was just about to start. And my first day home, my husband, who's a news guy, was away on assignment, and my son was in college, and I woke up alone in my apartment, and I didn't know what to do. I mean, I realized that since I was 16, I had gone from one job to another, and I had always defined myself as Ruth Reichl, comma. And, it was, restaurant owner, writer, restaurant critic, editor. And suddenly I was Ruth Reichl, nothing. And that's exactly what I felt like, nothing. And I started moving into this really wallowing in despair, and I realized that I couldn't let that happen. And so I sent an invitation to a bunch of friends and said, come over for tea and cake. And then I baked the biggest chocolate cake in the world. I baked a chocolate cake for 25 people. But I had always said that if I didn't have a day job, I would write a novel. So I immediately started trying to write a novel. Probably not the smartest thing to do when you're not in a very good place in your head, and I struggled with it. And every time I couldn't write, I found myself going into the kitchen. And I realized that I was doing what I've always done when I'm in trouble, was just vanishing into the kitchen. And I spent a lot of time wandering around farmers markets and talking to butchers and going to cheesemongers and going to Chinatown and gathering up ingredients and bringing them home and playing with them. Fast forward 6 or 7 months, and we at Gourmet continue to have reunions. And we were having one of these reunions, and we usually meet in a very cheap and cheerful restaurant in Chinatown, because it's the only place I know where you can get a private room for free. And one of my colleagues looked down at this kind of greasy tablecloth and said, "Boy, this must be really hard for you. You have been, you're so used to being in great restaurants. How long has it been since you didn't have an expense account? And I did the math. 1978. And he looked at me and he said, are you telling me that for more than 30 years you've been able to eat in any restaurant in the world on someone else's dime? And I said, yeah. And he said, boy, you must really miss those great restaurants. And I looked at him and I realized that I didn't. And I said, I have just loved being able to cook. I haven't been able to really cook for a long time because I've just been too busy. And the being in the kitchen has been such a pleasure that I didn't even realize that I wasn't going to restaurants. And he said, as long as I've known you, you have said that your mission in life was to get people back into the kitchen. Maybe you should write a cookbook. And for me, it was like really one of those light bulbs going off over your head. Oh, maybe I should write a cookbook. So I called my editor and said, what would you think about me writing a cookbook? And she liked the idea. And, I realized that if I wanted to do, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted it to have a narrative arc and that it was going to be about this year. And then I realized, well, if I'd set out to write a cookbook, I would have been very sensible and I would have said, okay, I need 40 vegetable dishes and 20 seafood dishes and, so many desserts. But now I'm kind of stuck with whatever it is that I've been cooking. And then I decided that would probably be okay. And then I was very happy that I had taken notes. Whenever I made a dish I liked, I wrote it down. So I had the recipes. But I never kept a diary. But I did have my tweets. And so my tweets were very much like when I went back and read them, it was almost like opening a vein and, knowing exactly emotionally where I had been in the course of that time. And so I said to my editor, I want to use the tweets and I want it to be a very narrative book. And she said, fine. Before I wrote the book, I ended up writing the novel because I really did have this sense of, I must write a novel. MFK Fisher used to say to me, every writer wants to write a novel. And I, being brought up in publishing where, my father was a book designer and fiction was really the highest calling. So I felt this great need to do it. But when I was done with that, I had the great joy of writing this book, which is the only book I've ever written that was easy. Every other book I've ever done has been rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And this book was kind of like a miracle. It kind of just wrote itself. It's pretty much the first draft in the book. There were a few comments from my agent and my editor, but mostly it's what I intended it to be, except that when I had told my editor what I wanted the book to be, I said, I think of it as a little book. And we actually called it The Little Book. And I imagined it as about the size of a diary, something that you would take to bed and read at night, that would have no photographs and no drawings. It would just be a narrative. And Susan, my editor, agreed to this. And then I sent her the manuscript. And she called me a little bit later and said, do you want the good news or the bad news? And I said, okay, let's start with the good news. And she said, we all love your manuscript. And I said, all right, now what's the bad news? And she said, we really want photographs. And I said, but no, you agreed, and if I was going to do photographs, I should have been doing them all along. And now it's going to take a year because we have to shoot it in season. And she said, we don't care. We want photographs. I was furious. I did my best to talk her out of it. And when Random House remained immovable on this topic, I called my creative director from Gourmet and said, "Ugh, I'm so angry. They want photographs. I've got to go back and shoot the whole damn book." And I said, "But if I have to hire a photographer, who should I hire?" And he said, "Well, Billy, there's only one person that you want to work with. You want to work with Mikkel Vang." So I called Mikkel, and Mikkel said, "Oh, I'm so over cookbooks." I, he said, "I have no desire to ever do a cookbook again. But send me your book and I'll take a look." And I sent him the book, and he called me the next day and said, "Okay, I stayed up all night reading your book. I love it. I want to shoot it, but here's the rules." He said, "This book is really naked. It's honest. It's very emotional. And I want the photographs to be that way too. So I'll come up for a few days every season, but I'm coming alone with no assistant, no lights. I'm just bringing a camera, and you're going to work alone. It's just going to be you. No prop stylist, no food stylist. Just the two of us." He said, "You'll cook a dish. We'll take it out of the oven. We'll find a plate in your cupboard. We'll plop it onto the plate. I'll take a photograph, and then we'll eat it." And that's what we did. Except that what we contracted with Mikkel was that he would shoot 20 food shots a season. Nobody said to him, "Oh, and by the way, why don't you shoot Ruth while she's cooking, and shoot the lawn and the woods and the landscape." He just did that. And when Susan, the designer, got the book, she was told by Random House to essentially put in 20 food shots a season. And when the book came back, it was kind of a mess. It just didn't look good. And then I gave her some suggestions, and she did an iteration, and it didn't look good. And finally I called her and I said, "You know what? Why don't you just do what you want, and let's see what that would look like?" And she, with no direction from anybody, just took all of these photographs of Mikkel's and made this truly beautiful book. But it was an accident, I mean, this is not the book I envisioned. And in many ways, doing this project reminded me of everything that was great about working at Gourmet. I mean, the most wonderful thing about magazine making is it's the most collaborative work you can possibly do. And I remember going into meetings and we would say, "Okay, let's do a Paris issue." And everybody would throw out ideas. And we'd write them all down, and then we'd have another meeting. And I remember coming out of those meetings and thinking, I wonder what this issue is going to look like. I mean, everybody would take it and make it better, and it was always a surprise what we ended up with. And I feel like that's what happened with this book. It was the most joyous kind of collaboration with talented people, and a complete surprise. And the response to the book has also been a complete surprise to me. I have never done anything that was beloved as this book, or that seems to have so many subtexts. I mean, what I thought I was writing about was the things I discovered in my kitchen year, which were many things. One of the things I discovered was that it was a real mistake to define myself by my job. And that after having this big job, because those Condé Nast editor jobs they're very princess jobs, you spend a lot of time around famous people, rich people, they take wonderful care of you, and you get used to waiting for wonderful things to happen to you all the time. And I realized that for me, the real secret to life is learning to find joy in ordinary things. And that at any point, there are horrible things going on in the world, and there's lots of reasons to be in despair. But there are also lots of things that remind us of why we're glad to be alive. And for me, those things, many of them take place in the kitchen. And there are wonderful little moments of grace every time I cook. And that, for you, cooking may not be your passion, but there is something that will get you back to that place where you're grateful again for just being alive and for, the wonderful things that happen every day. The other things that I learned were that for me, cooking is a real kind of meditation, and that I really need to pay attention in the kitchen. And I wanted to say that in the book. And I think one of the biggest things that I wanted to say in the book is that, and I feel some guilt about this myself, because I feel like the food media has, over the last 15 or 20 years, made people afraid of cooking, made people feel that if you cannot cook at a chef level, it's not worth cooking at all. And we've turned cooking into a performative act, a test, when, for me, the great thing about cooking isn't the end. It isn't the meal that you end up with, but it's the journey. And it's the fact that every time I'm in the kitchen, I learn something new. And I really wanted this book to say to people, if you don't make a perfect meal, there's another meal in a few hours. It doesn't matter. Just give yourself permission to enjoy the cooking. And I wanted to write recipes in a way that I don't think has really been done before, but which I wanted each recipe to be a story in itself. And I wanted, I feel like so many recipes are marching orders, they're lectures, and I wanted these recipes to be a conversation, and I wanted the recipes to be your recipes, not my recipes, and I wanted us to be in this together. But the joy of this book is that so many people have taken so much else away from it that every time I talk to people, I find something new in the book. And one of the things that I feel about all the books that I've written is that it sometimes takes me 15 or 20 years to really know what I was doing in a book. So I very much look forward to the journey that this book is going to have as it's out there in the world, and to finding out what else I'm going to learn from it. I would be happy to answer any questions that anybody cares to throw at me. Okay.
Hi, my name is Andy. I'm Director of Author Events, and I'm very pleased that we have Ruth Reichl here this evening. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Who would like to start us off? I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of questions. Right here in the front row, and then we'll head in back.
I've loved your memoirs over the years, and I look forward to reading this. My question is about the way people seem to cook nowadays, mostly getting recipes from the web. And I wonder if you have a thought about how it used to be you had a lot of cookbooks, you buy new cookbooks. Now I often just Google somebody's recipe that I know is going to be on the web rather than reading the cookbook. How do you feel this is going to change? Well, you get the idea.
Interestingly, cookbooks are one of the things, the big successes in publishing these days. And I think the reason is that you use the web in a very different way than you use cookbooks. If you go to the farmer's market and you buy a pumpkin, you come home and you will Google pumpkin recipes. When you buy a cookbook, you're looking for inspiration. You're looking for ideas. I think they're kind of apples and oranges, and I think people want to be inspired. It's why, food magazines are still doing well too. People often want just ideas, not for specific ingredients.
Yeah, back here on our right.
Now that you've written Delicious, which I enjoyed quite a bit, I'm wondering if you foresee ever doing any more novels.
I actually have a contract to write 2 more novels. And I have, I am right now about halfway through the gourmet memoir. And I am sort of taking notes for the novel. I mean, I know what the first novel is about, and I'm spending time getting to know the characters. I'm having a lot of fun with that.
Back here on our left, and then we'll head to the aisle.
Hi there. I am wondering if, in addition to your writing work, your memoirs and your novels and things that you're working on, if there's anything else that you have in the works as far as feeding that collaborative energy that you enjoyed so much at the magazine, and maybe you and Michael Pollan can go on a tour together and help convince everyone to do home cooking, or things like that.
I actually got a very intriguing note from someone yesterday saying that he was a wealthy man. I know nothing. I mean, this is just something that came in through LinkedIn. That this guy is a professor who has been contacted by somebody very wealthy who wants to know if I want to start a magazine. So I said, well, I wouldn't say no. And one of the things that in these endless, wonderful gourmet reunions we have, in about a year ago, a group of us had this notion of doing a Kickstarter to do one perfect current issue of Gourmet, and we started talking about what it would look like and how different it would be. I mean, because it's the notion of doing what Gourmet would have evolved into now is really, really fascinating to me and to all of us. So we may do that.
There's a lady about halfway back in black, and then somebody on the right there.
Hi, Ruth. I've really enjoyed your memoirs as well as your critical writing. I always read you all every week in the Times. What are two or three of your favorite cookbooks of all times?
Oh, great question.
Other than your own.
There's, I think, a deeply underappreciated French cookbook writer, Edouard de Pomian, who was a scientist who was working in the 30s. He had a radio show in Paris in the 30s. And there's an old book of his called French Cooking in 10 Minutes that is the most wonderful cookbook. It's so sensible. And, I mean, it's written in a really lovely way. And I give that book to people all the time. I'm very fond of Marcella Hazan. She never lets you down. Paula Wolfert never lets you down. Marianne Cunningham's Breakfast Book is truly a great book. And I can say this because it's not my book, but the Yellow Gourmet Cookbook is kind of my go-to book.
Back on the right.
Hi, I'm really excited to be here. I read Garlic and Sapphires when I was in 4th grade and wrote a book report on it. And now I'm a junior in college at Penn, and I'm in charge of the food and dining magazine over there. It's called Pen Appetit. and our board really loves you. And my question for you is, so I'm interested in going into food journalism professionally, and I also edit the work of a lot of young food journalists at Penn. So I was wondering what you think are some of the common mistakes food journalists will make in their writing.
Oh, interesting question. I think the most common mistake is, the operative word in food writer isn't food, it's writer. And I think one of the big mistakes that people make is that they think that the subject itself is so interesting that they don't have to use their imagination. And I think that the good food critics these days are doing really wonderful criticism, but there are still people who don't understand that restaurant criticism should not be consumer reporting. Criticism, whether it's about food, whether it's about art, whether it's music or film, should really be giving the audience a better way to appreciate whatever it is that they're consuming. And that's very different than telling you how to spend your money. There are so many interesting ways to approach that topic that actually make your readers smarter, and I don't think enough people use them. I don't know if that's answering your question, but...
Off to our left here.
Condé Nast pulled the plug on the Gourmet magazine at the bottom of the crisis. Had they been a little more patient, had they waited a year or 18 months, do you think the magazine could have survived?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the truth is that the money... Gourmet was financially successful for 68 of its 69 years. It was, in Condé Nast terms, we put it out very cheaply. The money we were losing was, for Condé Nast, a rounding error. I mean, of course it could have survived if they had. Why did they close it? I have no idea. It's a privately held company. They don't have to explain it to anyone, and they never explained it to me.
More questions. Oh, we have more. Right here in the fifth or sixth row. And while we're getting to this lady, I have a question for you about your father. Can you tell us a bit about what his design work was like and what some of the books were?
Yeah. My father's most famous book was the American edition of Ulysses. He drew that S, that big stately plump, and he actually he was his career. He came to this country in 1926 and went to work at. He was the art director at Doubleday in 1927, and his career lasted until 1980 when he died. He was still working. He did thousands and thousands of books, and at the end of his life, he actually spent the weekends going through. He had everything he had designed, and he put a little card into every book that he thought had some interesting design issue. For instance, for Portraits and Prayers by Gertrude Stein, he used the first time that offset photography was printed directly on a binding. And it was her face, like kind of bleeding off. And he wanted to put the back of her head on the back cover, so you would have the sense that you were like seeing that her head was in there. And Bennett Cerf wouldn't let him do it. So he went through all his books, putting these cards in them. And after he died, Columbia asked for his library. So last year, a professor of graphic design came up and did a show at Columbia of his work. And when I thanked her, it was wonderful for me, because she had actually discovered his work by reading in Tender at the Bone that he was a book designer, and then finding out that he was at Columbia, that the collection was at Columbia. And she went up and she read all these cards that he had written and gave a wonderful lecture on his work. I mean, he really believed that the designer was in the service of the writer. And his most deeply held belief was that good design you didn't notice. You just thought, this book was so easy to read. And he was not a flashy designer, and he loved type more than anyone I have ever met. And he knew, he would say, this is the Caslon in linotype or whatever, because the descenders on the Ys are different in this iteration of it than in another. He also was one of the first people to do computer design. One of his last things was a Bible, and he said, I always wanted to make the Bible a beautiful book. And in those days, you couldn't get all these fonts in different sizes, and he designed, he got Palatino, and he did it, he reduced it so the entire Bible is done in Palatino. He was very proud of that, although he was a staunch atheist. But when I'm sorry, this is a long answer, but I love my dad. When I thanked Martha, this woman who did the show on Dad, she said, your father has been a wonderful companion. And I realized she kind of fell in love with him as she was reading his little cards. Thank you for asking.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, right here.
You will hate this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You will hate this question.
Oh, okay.
But you have so much passion, maybe you'll answer it. Did you have one absolutely favorite issue of Gourmet? Or two, if you prefer?
That's a great question. I had many favorite issues, but probably the thing that, there are stories that are favorites with me more than, David Foster Wallace considered The Lobster, which scared me to death, but I was very proud that I did it. We did a little insert, a little magazine that had it was 100 pages and it had only 2 pages of ads in it. That was totally sponsored by Philips, which was wonderful because for once you didn't have to worry about the ads ruining all your wonderful words and pictures. I was really proud of the piece that Barry Estabrook did on tomato slaves. He did this sort of seminal piece. I sent him down to Florida for a month to be with the tomato workers in Immokalee, Florida. And he wrote a piece about how they worked in a state of slavery and actually turned it into a book after the magazine closed called Tomatoland. But that story, it changed that fight. After that piece came out, the supermarkets agreed to give the Immokalee workers the 2 cent a pound raise they wanted. I was real proud of that. I mean, Juno Diaz did a fantastic piece for us. I loved the 60th anniversary issue we did, where we went back and excerpted things from every decade. I liked a lot of what we did, I have to say. But thanks for asking.
A few more questions. Yeah, in here, right in front, and then there's a lady in gray.
Hi. As a young mother and head of a family, I would love to read those November issues because, cooking Thanksgiving dinner was important and it was intimidating. And every year I would, pour over all my past November issues. So thank you very much. And the question is, what is your now, and now because I don't have the magazine, what is your current perfect Thanksgiving dinner?
Well, actually, in this book, there is a lot about Thanksgiving because Thanksgiving at our house lasts for a week. And, you know, people come from all across the country, and we have people sleeping all over the floor. And what I love about Thanksgiving is the eating just goes on, you know, for a week. So it's not just turkey, it's, you know, all the food up until then. And then on Thanksgiving Day itself, whole group comes out from the city. Bud Trillin always comes and sort of plunks himself at the counter and tells great stories all day as we're cooking. But as I say in the book, after many, many years as a food editor at, you know, first the LA Times and then at Gourmet, I have come to believe that the one thing you should not agonize about is the turkey. And I use the high heat turkey method, which is basically you put salt and pepper on it. You don't brine it. You put salt and pepper on it. You stick it in a hot oven. You take it out an hour and a half later. You don't worry about it. And that leaves you time for the important things, which are gravy. I think the gravy is very important, and you need to make a lot of it. The side dishes are all, you know, important. But, you know, I mean, the thing about Thanksgiving is that most of us are now pressured into making the favorite things of the family. So, I mean, I make 2 stuffings that my family would go crazy if we didn't make those 2 stuffings every year. And Nick insists on the pomegranate gravy that was from an old Gourmet issue. So, like, what I can change, and then Michael wants pecan pie, and Nick wants pumpkin pie, and, you know, somebody else wants apple pie. So I only have like one other pie that I get to play around with. You know, I think for most of us, you pretty much know what you're going to make for Thanksgiving with like 1 or 2 little changes, don't you?
Yeah, right here, 3rd row, and then there's a lady in gray. If you'd wait for the mic, it's coming to you.
So one of the fun things is when you started out, the food industry in the U.S. was really in its infancy. You grew with Alice Waters, and today it's fetishized and it's corporatized. And I'm wondering if you have an opinion on the chefs who have empires, and if you see you know, it's wonderful. Philly's got a fabulous restaurant scene, but it's sort of food has taken over theater and arts, and it's become sort of more important than anything else. And I'm wondering sort of your worldview of where it's been, where it's going.
I couldn't be happier. I think food now has taken its rightful place. And you're talking about the kind of glamour side of it. But the other side of it is we have raised a generation of young people who understand that eating is an ethical act. And, you know, the kinds of choices that people are making, I mean, people understand, I think, for the first time in my lifetime, that their food choices really matter, and that they matter for lots of reasons. There's a social justice movement now. There's a sustainability movement. And it all has come out of, you know, the fetishization of food. And I think it's all directly traceable to food television. I gave a speech in Mexico City about a month ago. There was a wonderful food conference with people from all over the world, and everybody had a topic, and mine was communication. And I found myself, to my surprise, saying that I feel like that the food press has in many ways dropped the ball. And I think that the closing of Gourmet has had a kind of chilling effect on people doing serious food journalism in food magazines. I mean, it gets done in other publications. But that chefs have stepped in. And there are so many chefs now who use their celebrity to do wonderful things and to point out the problems that we have, and to go into schools and make, school lunch programs and to testify in Congress. And I think it's a kind of wonderful time in food. And yeah, we started with really stupid food television, but look where we ended up.
Yeah, on our left here.
Hi. I've read 3 of your books and found them to be just delightful and delicious. And I have 2 practical questions to ask because I love cooking and I love looking at recipes and reading everything. Do you cook in a test kitchen or do you cook in your kitchen? And how many versions of a recipe does it take for you to finally say, I can put it in the book?
I don't cook in a test kitchen. I cook at home. And I play around with it until I think it tastes good. And then all the recipes in this book I sent to a recipe tester who tested them. And then I ended up making them all again for the photographer, so they were tested another time. And then I have an assistant who is wonderful but not a cook, and I got her to make them because I thought, it's one thing for a professional test person to do it. And Suki's questions were really useful because there were things that I wouldn't have thought of. And she doesn't have a lot of equipment. So these recipes have pretty much been tested 4 times.
A couple more questions. Gentleman here, and then a lady in the middle, about 6 rows back.
Good evening. Ruth, I have a couple of questions. One is, where did you eat or where do you plan on eating dinner this evening? And number 2, if you could recommend restaurants in Philadelphia, which would you recommend?
I don't know Philadelphia restaurants very well, and I landed this morning and immediately tweeted, where should I eat? And based on what people on Twitter told me, I went to lunch at Federal Donut and then across the street to Dizengoff. And then I went down the street to an oyster bar and had a bunch of clams on the half shell. And I was planning to go to Market on High Street. But by then I was kind of full. And, the place that intrigues me most that I will try to go to dinner at is Veg. But, you really have a great restaurant, an interesting restaurant scene here.
What kind of chicken did you get?
I got the chicken with the hot garlic sauce.
Yes, I see. Yeah.
It was delicious.
Okay, there's somebody on
I ate too much of it. There was somebody way in the back.
Yeah, in the middle, actually, right here. Eileen, do you see this lady? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I heard you say today that one of the pleasures that you have is shopping for food, ingredients. And I was just thinking that we don't all have the same opportunities to find really good ingredients. And what are your thoughts about how we can maybe equalize that? I heard you talking about the cheesemonger and the butcher, and we in the city have that, but a lot of other people don't,
if you're talking about the disparity in the food system, it's the most shameful thing that's happening in this country right now. Those of us who are can afford it, get to eat vegetables that were picked by angels that have never been touched by pesticides, and animals who have grazed happily outdoors, and chickens who have never been in cages. And people who can't afford it are stuck eating stuff that's like cheaper than food, and that is essentially killing them. And the most shameful part of that to me is that so many of the people who are relegated to eating that second-class stuff that really is not food and that is poisoning them and making them sick are precisely the people who are picking our beautiful produce and washing our dishes in restaurants and packing our meat. And I really believe that, we're all very proud of the sustainability movement in this country. But until we include and recognize the fact that America's food system runs on the backs of undocumented workers who are not paid fairly, and we will not have a sustainable food system. And that, for me, that's the thing I'm working with. I work with a group in New York called the Rural and Migrant Ministry. And that to me is the number one problem we have in this country.
What is your absolutely favorite recipe and your least favorite recipe?
Oh, that's, I don't have a favorite recipe. And, I would say my go-to recipe, the thing I always have in my cupboard, is I can always make spaghetti carbonara. And at the drop of a hat, I've always got bacon, Parmesan cheese, eggs, and pasta. Is it my favorite recipe? I don't know. My least favorite recipes are, I don't make them. I don't like fussy food, I think I am not a chef. I don't think that people who aren't chefs should think that they need to cook chef food. So I, open up these recipe books that have these ludicrous things that, require an entire kitchen brigade and the skills of a chef, and think, why is anybody torturing themselves making these things?
Final question in the middle here.
You said at the beginning, I was talking to MFK Fisher, and she said, and I just love the notion that you had these friendships with other people from other eras in the food world. Would you talk just a little bit about what those friendships were like?
Yeah. So Mary Frances Fisher I was sent by Ms. Magazine in the late 70s to do a profile of her. And actually the editor who called me said, have you ever heard of MFK Fisher? And, she was, I worshipped her writing, but she was kind of out of fashion at that point. And I was too shy to call her. So I sent her a postcard and said, can I come interview you? And I went to her house, and she had this beautiful, it was what she called Last House, that was on somebody's ranch, and she'd made this agreement that he would build this house for her, but when she died, it would go into his estate. And what everybody asked me was, what's her kitchen like? And her kitchen was ordinary, and she actually, to my great shock, had an electric stove that she defended. But the truly remarkable thing about her house was the bathroom. She had this bathroom that was huge. It was painted red, with a bathtub in the middle and bookshelves all around. And it was just, I looked at it and thought, this is a woman who knows how to live. And she ended up really taking me under her wing, and I went back and back and back. And she was very important to me because at a certain point in my life, she said to me, you need to go work at a newspaper. And I said, why? And she said, you're polishing every word. You're spending way too long on every article that you're writing. And you need to go to a place where an editor will say to you, I need 800 words in an hour. And you write those 800 words, and they're not very good, but you know that tomorrow they're going to be wrapping someone's garbage. And she said, you need that discipline. And it was the best writing advice I ever got. But I was really lucky enough to, Alice Waters has been a friend for 40 some years. I knew James Beard, and who was not very nice to me the first time I met him. And Marion Cunningham, actually, who was kind of my adopted mother, introduced me to him. And afterwards, I said to him, that I loved, my husband and I make your tomato pie all the time. And he looked at me and went, really? With such disdain. And when I said to Marion, he wasn't very nice, and she said, oh dear, I should have stayed with you. He's much nicer to the boys.
Good place to end. Ladies and gentlemen, Ruth Reichl.